My name is Mark Hunziker, and I'm State Section Director for MUFON Los Angeles. Our program this evening is presenting Freddy Silva on crop circles and sacred sites and the energy connection. Freddy's been with us before and was here just a little over a year ago, I believe, and we've had a number of requests for his return because of that presentation, and he's got new information for us tonight. And the crop circle phenomena in itself is one that I use for my conversations with most people about my interests, and because it's a good baseline for people in having them understand just how much we don't hear about these things from our national press and our media. And when I begin talking about my interests, I usually go to the crop circle phenomena because it's a fairly benign phenomena. It's something that doesn't permanently damage the crops, and yet it leaves an indelible image in all of our minds once we see these things in their glory and their splendor. So when researchers like Freddy Silva come to us from England, where most of that phenomena is centered, it's always exciting. We have Barbara Lamb, who has presented on it, and a couple of other researchers. This is always something that interests a large number of our group. So without any further ado, we're happy to bring back Freddy Silva from England, and we hope you enjoy the program. Give him a warm applause on his entry here.
Mine, here you go. Thanks, Mark. Hello again. It's been a while since I've been here, and of course I've lost a little bit more hair since I was here last. That's the dangers of research. But then again, so have you. Then that's okay. I feel much better about it. Can I have the? Can I just lower that light a little bit, if you can, and just? Do I have control over the slides? I do indeed. You'll have to tell me if these are in focus or not, because I can't quite see from here, so scream. I wanted to try something particularly complex in trying to get this information across. It's a very, very bizarre subject, this crop circle phenomenon. And it touches on so many different levels of a subject, so many different levels of being, that trying to express a piece of information in one go is always quite a high job indeed. And in trying to relate crop circles, churches and sacred sites, and establishing the energy relationship that happens in between them, my job is to try and take you through a 45-degree angle into the phenomenon and through it, to get an appreciation of just how much complexity is involved. So without much further ado, I wanted to sort of begin with a bit of etymology. I'm actually betrayed by my accent. I'm actually Portuguese by birth. I collect passports for a living. I'm an American citizen, I'm a British citizen, I'm everything. But my heritage as a Portuguese person, it's kind of interesting because everybody in Europe seems to have gone there on holiday and settled over the last 4,000 years. In fact, it used to be a place called Lusitania, the land that holds the light. And subsequently, we've had Egyptians, Greeks, Phoenicians, Romans, Moors, French, Romans. Everybody seems to have gone there and left a little bit behind. So consequently, when I go to places like Egypt, I find myself hearing certain words which are very familiar in my language. So it's not by sort of accident that I'm very fascinated with the origin of words. And case in point is the word church. If you take church as an Old English and Norse word, it's actually kirk. And kirk is derived from the Greek kirkos, which means a circle, which means the Lord's house. So even at the etymological stage, there is a connection that exists between the circles of stone, the circles of worship, and our houses of worship. And when I mean churches, I don't just mean churches in the Christian sense of the word. I also mean synagogues, mosques, and any other place of worship, to include everybody. Now, as if that's not enough of a connection, sometime in the mid-1980s, we also started getting some other sacred signs in the fields, crop circles. And these circular temples have mystified people for a long, long time. In fact, so long that we have reports of them going back to 1890, when farmers in southern England used to come across sort of swirling masses of wind and light. And they used to call them the devil's whirlwinds, and they used to create witches' rings. They used to describe very interesting features about how these whirlwinds would go about their work and flatten the plants in a very precise manner. And to the point where the plants used to do strange things. They would be swirled in a very precise manner, but always just above the soil, and to a point where if you put a pitchfork underneath the plants, they seem to sort of spring back down as if they'd been made molten at the base and then rehardened. Well, this is something that we've discovered in the latter days of research in the 70s. But going back from that, we even have a report from 1678 by no less than the director of what was then the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which has since become a great seat of learning in England. And the director himself pointed out that he made several investigations of bizarre witches' rings around Oxfordshire, England, and Staffordshire, two other little counties. And he was saying that he would find these rings and circles and hexagons and squares, but there was something unusual about them in the fact that the soil inside them seemed to have been noticeably drier than the soil without. And of course, England is not exactly famed for drought. So it was kind of interesting to find that he was already taking notice into the science, if you like, the subtle science of what went on inside these spaces. He also remarked that there's a certain sulfurous substance that he would smell when he would pick up the crop, as if something had been boiled on the inside. He'd also noticed that something had unusual fertilizing influence that happened to the soil itself, because the plants that grew afterwards in these fields seemed to do much better. Well, you could exchange 1678 for 1998 because the farmers in southern England also remark about the very, very same things. So clearly this is not a new phenomenon by any means. And it's a phenomenon and a mystery that's not exactly helped by the media either, because most of the stuff that you hear in the media is always portraying this thing as a big hoax, perpetuated by a group of bored pub chums who went out and did it all in one evening. In fact, they managed to do 10,000 of these things in 28 countries, racking up an unusual amount of air miles, all without their wives noticing. And it was only when they felt that their wives were onto them that they decided to finally own up. Well, that's wonderful. But the trouble is that at the heart of the mystery, we're still dealing with physical evidence, and the physical evidence on the ground seemed to betray all these claims. And part of the physical evidence is the fact that these plants seem to have been bent almost at a right angle just above the soil without any damage. And in fact, if you do try to bring them back to the vertical posture, they will sort of crack at the base. They do this very undamaged. They also exhibit some very, very unusual things, like the roots are bending the wrong way. Now, if any of you are gardeners, you'll know that the roots tend to grow downwards towards the center of gravity, which is usually in the center of the earth. So why should they be doing this? Very mysterious indeed. We have, over the course of 20 years of modern research, detected electromagnetic fingerprints, which exist within crop circles and not without. We also find that there are gravitational effects taking place and manipulations of the local electromagnetic field. So clearly something is going on that's beyond our capacity as humans to create something that does things like this. When you put plants under a microscope, you'll also find that they've been affected by an unusual energy at the crystalline level. The top picture here shows a normal sample of wheat placed under a microscope, showing the crystalline structure of the plant. And the one at the bottom was taken from a crop circle, again in the same field, but you can see that there's a huge deviation from normal. So clearly something is interacting with the plants. We're also noticing that the soil has been heated to an unusual degree inside the crop circles, and recent suggestions seem to point to the fact that this has happened in about a fraction of a second, and the soil seems to have been heated to about 5,000 degrees centigrade, and yet the plants seem to be fine. So what's going on? Well, I'm going to have a little fun with you here, because I'm going to do a bit of remote viewing with you. I want to imagine that you are all bishops and bishopesses, in Northern Europe at a time of 640 AD. And now this is a bizarre time. Things were different at this era. This was a time when Christians were sort of persecuted by the emerging Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, when Muslims are actually working with Christians. Very, very strange indeed to the where we are today. But apart from all of these goings on, as a bishop or a priest in your municipality, you would have woken up this morning to find a letter on your doormat from the Archbishop in Rome, and you had been given a very curious set of instructions, and they would read like this. Let no Christian place lights at the temples or stone enclosures. Let no one presume to make lustrations or to enchant herbs, or to make flocks pass through a hollow of a tree or an aperture of the earth. For by so doing, so he seems to consecrate them to the devil. Well, the work of the devil, of course, at the time being any knowledge that was being pursued outside the strict confines of orthodox belief. But obviously the pagans didn't share the emerging church's opinion that the use of sacred sites in any way connected them with the forces of hell, because 300 years later they were still going to sacred sites of stone, they were worshipping wells, trees, oak groves, all kinds of things. In fact, they've been doing so for thousands and thousands of years. So by the 11th century, Pope Gregory at the time in Rome was again issuing very similar and very stern instructions to you to try and prohibit people from worshipping at sacred sites. And the penalties were quite extraordinary. I mean, at one point it actually became a heresy not to attend Mass, and you'd be imprisoned for doing so. But even more so, if you were a woman-bearing child and you would attend a stone circle or a needle of stone or a sacred well in order to induce childbirth, you would be forced to fast for 3 years. Chances of survival, slim. Pardon the pun. So obviously there was a huge resistance going on between the emerging religious systems and the pagans. And pagans, by the way, means nothing more than a country dweller. So in an abrupt change of strategy, the church decided to assimilate the old pagan sites, and sometimes with extraordinary subtlety. This particular one is an old dolmen in northern Portugal, not far from my grandparents grew up, and these rocks are about 32 feet high, and that's just what's outside the ground. What's below it is another matter of conjecture. But what was interesting when I started doing some of the research into these sites and looking at the connections was that the emerging faith also didn't just superimpose its sites on old sites, they also claimed the very type of energy that was there. Because if you actually went around the corner from this site to the local cafe and asked for the keys to go into this sacred site, you'd walk in and you find there'd be a little statue of the Virgin Mary, which was kind of interesting because the energy at this site was recorded to have been feminine in principle. So clearly the emerging church also knew what was there. There was something very, very important about the way it chose to superimpose its sites on existing sites, not just because it wanted to supplement and superimpose its own belief system. Well, we take a look at the language of the church, and there are a lot of giveaways there. When you walk into a place of worship, you walk for a place called the entrance. What is it entrancing? And when you walk through the entrance and you go down to a place called the nave, which in Latin is navis, which means a boat, you are transported on a boat and you disembark at the other end of the church at a place called the altar. What is it altering? And in the old days, altar actually used to be spelled with an E, very blatant, pointing to what was there. Not only that, but in most European settings, you'll find that the altar is actually covered by a type of rock, red granite, which is very, very powerful in the enhancing of electromagnetic energy. So these things were clearly done for a very, very good reason. We seem to have lost half a church. Is there any way you can bring that forward a little bit? The slide projector, if possible. Thank you. You go forward about 100 years, and the Romanesque period of simple church building and assimilation of sites suddenly developed into something very dramatic. We had the rise of the Gothic building period, and this was a time when the Black Death was ravishing Europe. People were dying, people were starving, there was no money, and yet, despite all this, thank you very much, Despite all of this, these wonderful sermons in stone were erected across the length and breadth of Europe, costing enormous sums of money, with stone that was beautifully hewn and sites carefully chosen. Well, we look at the people who created these beautiful masterpieces. They were none other than the Knights Templars or the Freemasons. People who have been very well maligned since the rise of Philip V in France at the time, because these were people who were not going around worshipping the devil, or they were around killing innocent people. These were people who brought out of Egypt the knowledge of the ancient mystery schools of Egypt. And these were schools that dealt with very esoteric principles about life, about energy, and how to use it for the benefit of all. And as keepers of the Egyptian mystery schools, they also brought with them the secrets concerning the use of energy. Well, when you take apart a lot of these Gothic cathedrals in Europe, you'll find that the buildings are actually encoded with something called sacred geometry. It's buried, for example, in the cathedral at Chartres. And if you ever want an education on the incredible encodability of information into a house of stone, Chartres is the place to start studying. You'll spend a lifetime on this. Now, this fascinated many, many people, including me, over the decades, about why they went about building these beautiful buildings and encoding them with geometry that you can't really see when you first look at the blueprint. Well, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the records of the KGB and all its scientists fell into public hands. And it turned out that many of their scientists were also preoccupied with the idea of geometry, and particularly geometric shapes in relationship to the human body and its concordant effects. They found that, for example, putting people in buildings that were shaped like pentagrams or pentagons, that the rate of healing used to be magnified significantly. In Bulgaria, when they put schizophrenics in hospital wards shaped like trapezoids, the rate of schizophrenia would go down by many, many, many levels. It was a useful aid to actually help people recover their particular symptom. Now, the Russians went on to do all kinds of experiments in the Gothic cathedrals, and they also found that there were certain sonic frequencies that were actually resonating with the human body. In fact, they found at one point, when they were using Gregorian chant and putting people inside the Gothic cathedrals, that people's brainwave patterns would go up by as much as 4,000%. So clearly there was some kind of resonance interaction between these wonderful sermons of stone and the human body. But here's the best part. You look at these enormous buildings and you look at the place where they were built, and more often than not you'll find that they were built on completely architecturally unsuitable terrain, marshes. No one goes to that kind of trouble to build something on a marsh. It's going to sink. It doesn't make sense. So what is it about water that was so important that in certain cases these buildings used to be sited even miles away from their congregations? Because after all, the whole purpose of having a place of worship is that you could easily have the local population go and worship. It didn't make sense. Well, a lot of these sacred sites and the old churches, and particularly the ones that superimposed on the old sacred sites, they're all actually located above or near water. And of course, water is a conductor of energy. But more so, if you ever conduct a new spin on water, you also create an electromagnetic field. So clearly there's something about the use of water that made these places very, very special. And as of late, we've also found out that water is a great storer of memory. And we'll come to that later. But back to spin. Well, spin is very important. In fact, it's so important we take it for granted. It's nature's most efficient movement of energy. It's expressed in the spiral, and like I said, it's the fundamental shape of nature. We see it in the galaxies above and in the shells below. Very, very basic. In fact, it's so basic that without spin as a movement, the blood in your veins could not propel itself around the human body. You die. It is that fundamental to life. So fundamental, in fact, that our ancient ancestors even carved them on the walls of their sacred spaces, particularly one in Northern Ireland called Newgrange. It's a massive mound constructed of stone and mica and covered over with earth. Recently, put back together with great love and affection. And if you ever are in that part of the world, north of Dublin, do go and see it. It's a magnificent building, erected about 2600 BC. But you will find in many of these sacred sites all these spirals carved in the rocks, and that many years ago it was postulated that these were nothing more than decorative elements. I mean, otherwise the place would look dead boring without a bit of decoration. There was no paint, nothing. So you might as well have a bit of decoration. Not quite so, because experiments undertaken by Princeton University discovered that these places, very much like the Gothic cathedrals, also created a certain resonance effect. These experiments in which the chambers of Newgrange were filled with smoke and pumped with certain sonic frequencies were discovered to create spirals in the smoke. And not just anywhere, but at strategic points within its chambers, and specifically at points where these chambers were marked with spirals. It's almost as if the building itself was designed to have a certain resonant effect on the human body, but it was also strategically located to do so, very much like the cathedrals that became after it. But they found something even more important. When they took the actual relationship of the geometry that was encoded inside these very simple stone chambers, they found that there were certain harmonics that were also related to the to the diatonic music scale, which is basically the white notes, the pure notes of the music scale in our terms. So there was an understanding of sound also as a creative principle in these sacred spaces. Now, we have a very rich history in the British Isles alone of healing and invocation in sacred sites, and particularly heightened states of awareness and also healing. And the reason why I point all this out as a foundation is because it also happens to be the foundation of every crop circle. No matter how small it is, you'll find that the plants are always laid in a spiral pattern, and sometimes even when the designs have straight lines. At the very, very beginning of these straight lines, you'll find that the plants have been shaped just like nature's own spiral. And indeed they are, because in many, many measurements undertaken since the era of Pat Delgado or Colin Andrews, the original researchers of the crop circle phenomenon, we find a ratio that keeps popping up in the actual movement of the way the plants are laid. And it's called the golden mean ratio, also known as phi. This is nature's very own mathematical ratio, and in fact it's so prevalent, just like spin, that it actually underlies the very shape of plants, the shape of leaves, in fact the very ratios of the bones in the human hand. It's prevalent in anything. And we see this ratio in crop circles, no matter what the size. This is the golden mean ratio expressed in a crop circle that measures 1,000 feet from point to point to point. That's a small one. But the important connection here is that we also have been getting and collecting over the past 20 years in crop circles evidences of changes in awareness in people and also healings. Taking that a little step further, if you take the spiral as a primal movement of energy and move it around like a donut, you get something that, if anybody has studied Kabbalah, it's something called the tube torus, which is something that science has finally figured out that it's actually a fundamental movement in the generation of matter. In fact, this movement actually underlies the molecular structure of life itself. And if you try to slice this in half like an orange, you'll get something that would look like this. And throughout the crop circle phenomenon, we've had many references to the formulating principles of matter, as if someone's trying to give us some specific information. We also find that latter-day crop circles, and this is only a couple of years ago, they've also begun to, they've also begun to take the tube torus and give it a certain spin that almost looks like it's popping out of the page, almost as if it's three-dimensional. And this is the rise of the complexity of the phenomenon right here. And perhaps it's not by accident that they're trying to teach us a bit of a lesson, because when you take this spin and keep spinning it around, you start getting molecules, which of course are the building blocks of life, and particularly hydrogen, water. And we also get this expressed in the early crop circles around the 1980s. We have the hydrogen molecule expressed. We have the water molecule expressed as a crop circle. We even have atoms, which seems to have the electron spinning around it in crop circles. And then by the time we get to 1988, we started getting the carbon symbol, which we also happen to know is the Celtic cross. the elements of earth, fire, water, and air, all revolving around the spiritual whole. This is also the basis, by the way, of the what became known as the cross in Christian mythology, where the awakened individual, the Christed individual, if you like, is basically harnessed to the wooden cross, which is the four elements of matter. Gives it a completely different spin. Now, we take these molecules and make them very, very big, and we get them to be expressed in a very large effect. In fact, we now take them for granted as planets. We sit on our own very molecule. And there's nothing surprising about that, for sure. But what is surprising is that geometers throughout the centuries have become very engrossed with the idea of how the relationship of the planets seem to relate to each other in orbit. And in fact, when you take the mean orbits of the planets in the solar system and you start expressing them as a harmonic of each other, we start finding something very peculiar. We start discovering geometry. When you take the mean orbit of Mercury and Earth together, you get what's known, of course, as the pentagram. We have a 9-pointed star which defines the mean orbits of Jupiter and Neptune. The Earth of Jupiter is quite interesting. It shows 3 nested hexagrams relating to each other. That's 3 harmonics. So no wonder all this geometry was called sacred. It wasn't just because the ancients thought that by taking a bunch of lines and sticking them all together and making a coherent shape out of it was anything to do with magic, which in a way it is. It was the fact that it was an expression of the very movements taking place upstairs, and by taking this information, this sacred geometry, and imprinting it on the buildings below, some kind of universal order could be bestowed upon the earth, and its effects could be transferred onto people like us. One very important thing to remember here, when you take 2 areas, and these 2 areas are actually defined by a perfect square, you also get something else. You get a 2-to-1 ratio. And if anybody is into music, you know that that 2-to-1 ratio is an octave in music. And this is what the Greeks meant when they were talking about the harmony of the spheres, the music of the heavens. In fact, the Greeks were actually quite amused by all of this. Not so much so because they had actually borrowed their information from the Egyptians over the course of a few millennia. But the Greeks actually called the planets, or referred to them as the acousmata, or the acoustic ones. Again, pointing out the importance of sound as a creating principle. And this is one of my holiday slides. If you ever go somewhere in Egypt, and I always suggest you, to anybody they do, it's a wonderful place to go, very friendly people. If there's one temple you go to Luxor. You will not forget it, you will not be let down. A wonderful temple to humanity. But the Egyptians were masters of encoding this geometry. In fact, they did so on their temples, and they applied it liberally across the landscape. But there was something about also the placing of the temples that was very significant. They didn't just go around the Nile and look for some beautiful palm trees and find a nice bend in the trees to put these temples up as a place where they could have great barbecues. And there was something much more important about the placing of these sites. And what happened was they used to dowse for the location of the sites as points of energy. So after locating the strategic energy points across the land, each temple was then designed to create specific resonant environments to affect particular states of mind. Each one of these temples was specifically designed. You would go in certain parts and be cured or affected to a certain level of awareness depending on where you were on the land. Now, if you ever doubt the divinity of dowsing, consider that even during the Vietnam era, that the US Army even instructed its soldiers to actually practice the art of dowsing and locating enemy traps, even underground bunkers. In the Second World War, it was used to locate enemy submarines, I kid you not, with a 95% rate of accuracy. And even during the 1980s, all American oil companies still employed dowsers in an unofficial capacity to locate vast amounts of underground oil. So clearly something works. That's interesting. Oh, it is the right way around. Okay, I'm just seeing it from the wrong side. But there's something more about the construction of the temples and the relationship of the Egyptian temples which is of interest, because the Egyptians too were very fascinated by the use of the golden mean, the phi ratio. And again, as you can see, they applied it liberally to encode it in the construction of their temples. And in this case, the Temple of Luxor, which is actually designed to actually complement the actual shape of the human body. If you go into this little place here, this is called the Holy of Holies. And this is the bit where you go to achieve some very heightened senses of awareness. It's because the Egyptians were also masters of sound. To them, sound was everything. They manipulated sound, they used sound to move rocks. And if you take a look at the compound of the rocks which create the pyramids, you'll find that there's a certain quartz content that can be vibrated to create a certain type of levitation. But that's another story. But here, in this little space called the Holy of Holies, is where all the action happens. Still very active. But it's quite interesting because that's also the place in modern churches which is now called the altar. So we have the Holy of Holies and the altar as a tradition dating back over 6,000 years in our history. So again, clearly something's working here. But the net effect of all these effects that the Egyptians were playing with, again, were that the temples were harnessing energy and facilitating levels of awareness. If we go back before the Egyptians, our ancient ancestors too were fascinated by this process, but they just sort of took things a little bit simpler. They just carried 32 feet blocks of stone across 250 miles, some of these blocks weighing about 300 tons, supposedly for no apparent reason. In fact, if you go to this particular site in northern Portugal, you'll find that the local shepherd actually uses it to tether his sheep. But that wasn't the original purpose. There was a lot of trouble that these people went to mark these specific points. And again, if we look at the etymology of these sacred sites in Portugal, we find that they're called antas, which comes from the Latin annotare, to mark, to locate. So again, what was it marking? What was it locating? Well, what was it locating was the fact that, actually I'm a bit ahead of myself there, excuse me. We also find that when they put these rocks together and put capstones on them, we also found that they came up with a word to describe them called a betilu, which comes from the Semitic Beth El, meaning the house of God, which of course we now know is the place called Beth El-Hem. So this tradition now goes back to 8,000 BC across the Northern Iberian Peninsula. So there's a tradition that goes on here throughout the ages. At this point I became very fascinated in my own particular studies, and I'm not just the only one who's done these particular studies, by the way. I became fascinated with these sites as living points of energy, particularly the stone needles that were marking sites throughout Europe and the British Isles. I began marking them, I began dowsing them, and I began to formulate these maps of energy. This is one particular map. That little red dot there is that many that you just saw in the previous picture. And those little black rings, like ripples on a pond, are the exact locations of the points of electromagnetic energy that were emanating from this site. And I plucked many of these, dozens and dozens of these throughout the British Isles and Portugal, and found that there was a certain something going on in between them. There was a certain ratio in which these points of energy were located. And after much plodding around with the computer, I suddenly discovered that all these relationships, all these rings here, were related by sacred geometry. Not just pentagrams, but also hexagrams. And very, very precise detail to a margin of error down to about 4 inches over an 800-foot diameter, which is very, very precise. So here I began to appreciate the notion that the ancient ancestors did know about what was going as above, and they used to try and anchor it below, because by anchoring these enormous points of stone, they were performing a type of earth acupuncture. They were nailing down the very points of energy that would then be facilitating heightened senses of awareness, because let's face it, the human body too is electromagnetic in nature. But what they also marked was the point of an invisible crossroads of energy, a grid that extends and snakes its way around the world. So now we can understand that churches and ancient sacred sites lie at the same energy crossroads, and particularly the ones which assimilated ancient pagan sites. This is a dowsing map by an old geometer who passed away about 30 years ago called Guy Underwood in England. And he had a particularly fascinating life, or a very boring one, because every other spare time that he had, he would go around England dowsing every conceivable sacred site, all from Stonehenge all the way down to minute stones. And he always found that there was a certain organized field, energy field, that was available at these sites. So when he started doing with churches, things really began to get a little bit interesting, because what he found was that the churches themselves, and as I said earlier, they don't seem to be very strategically, they seem to be strategically located on the ground, but in very, very unusual places. Well, what Underwood did was very much prove that, because he found that the cruciform shape of the churches actually betrayed the energy field that was running right across the land. They were erected at the very crossroads of energy. But not only that, but he also found that the water courses that were under the ground, that also carried the memory, the energy, electromagnetism, they would carry the energy to a point through the front doors of the church and congregated right at the center of the crucifix. And of course, take them all the way into the altar, where very unusual things were beginning to happen. Even the chapter house at Salisbury Cathedral, where the energy and movement of sound was manipulated by people who knew what they were doing, again, you can see there's a spiral of energy of water that comes up from the ground. So the blueprint of the church concealed the very purpose for which it was built. And Underwood, of course, also discovered that emanating from the center of the crucifix were these wonderful rings and ripples of energy, just like the many that I've been working with in Portugal. So clearly there was something going on here. There was, it was all designed to conceal the energy print. But the point I'm making here is the fact that there's a shared common thread going on through here. We have the use of sacred geometry at sacred sites, we have electromagnetic energy at the sites, we have the use of sound. And all these sacred spaces were creating a resonant effect on the human body, which has been now proved to be electromagnetic in nature. In fact, a lady in the 70s that used to practice not too far from Los Angeles, at UCLA, Valerie Hunt, she wrote a fantastic book called Infinite Mind, which effectively maps the entire human body to the point where it even has polarity. In many cases, our right hands are positive, our left hands are negative, or male or female, if you prefer, which is why when you put your hands together in the act of prayer, it activates an electromagnetic grid in your own body. You suddenly become a bit of a powerhouse, which of course gives prayer a whole new meaning. And of course the sacred sites and the churches, again, all have a shared history of changes in brainwave patterns, of heightened states of awareness, and of course healings. And Cornwall alone, the Duchy of Cornwall in England, has at least 40-odd folklore stories dating back 2,000 years of all these sites relating to healing and its effects. Which brings us, of course, to our favourite subject. Because there is a historical connection between sacred sites and crop circles, because no matter where you go in the world where these things happen, and I'm talking about 28 countries now, no matter where they appear, they will always appear in the vicinity of an ancient sacred site. Very, very blatantly in many cases. And in the Americas, where we also do get crop circles, believe it or not, you'll find that after doing a little bit of digging around of local history, that the site was occupied in a former time by either Native American sacred sites. So it's worth doing a little bit of background checking when finding things in a place where the sites not even exist in terms of a physical form. But the funny thing is that the crop circles too contain electromagnetic signatures, just like the churches and the sacred sites. In fact, they also contain sacred geometry, sometimes blatantly and sometimes veiled. In this particular case, and what looks like a spider's web, you can actually take this design apart and find that it actually has two nested pentagrams relating its elements to each other. So we have hidden harmonic ratios, just like the Gothic cathedrals. We also have reported effects on awareness. We have a lot of raised right brain activity in crop circles. The researcher Lucy Pringle, I think, has at least 600 noted cases over the last 10 years of people experiencing heightened levels of awareness in terms of intuition or right brain activity. And in fact, if you ever try to do any task that relates to logic in crop circles, such as counting or measuring, you'll find doing this again, again, and again, because your left brain just seems to shut down. It's quite annoying, actually. But we too have a lot of references to healing. Many people have been healed in crop circles, including people who suffer from Parkinson's, retinal eye tumors, and people who've for 15 years not been able to lie down straight on a bed suddenly find they can do so at perfect ease without any help by lying down in these new temples. We also have in crop circles something very, very bizarre. Distortions in time. Now you might think this is a bit unusual, but experiments were done whereby people took digital clocks perfectly synchronized, left one about a mile away from a crop circle, took it into a crop circle, and then put the two together, only to find 20 minutes seemed to be missing. And I'll mention this again later. I'm just putting this for the record for the time being. Well, lo and behold, since the crop circles were related to sacred sites, it didn't take much of a leap to figure out that perhaps there was an energetic connection as well. And many people, and myself, took it to try and measure out what was going on here. In this particular case, we have a crop circle that appeared shortly after I'd actually measured and dowsed the sacred site of Windmill Hill, which is not far from the Avery Stone Circle you just saw in the slide before. This is a site of worship that dates back to over 6,400 BC, and we have these lovely little earthen mounds called tumuli, which many archaeologists would tell you are burial sites, except of all the ones that have been excavated, only 5% have ever yielded any burial remains. So clearly they were there for some other purpose. And at the time, when there was no crop circle on this field, I'd actually dowsed this area and found that they had polarity too. There was positive polarity, negative polarity, and neutral polarity, just like a wall socket. Well, this lovely little thing pops up, and lo and behold, found that it too lies at a crossroads of energy. In fact, the very crossroads of energy seems to actually define the very diameter of the shape of the design itself. Almost as if what we're seeing is a physical impression of an invisible energy field. But here's the best part, because the crop circle too had polarity. There's positive polarity, there was neutral polarity, and negative polarity. And all of these were related to the site right here, as if there was some kind of communication going on between the two elements. What was more was that about 3 months after this event, the polarities that were inherent in this crop circle that were not inherent in here suddenly became inherent in the design at the top, suggesting that what was down here was now influencing the energy pattern on the land. There was a communication and an imprinting of new energy going on. I show this because it's just beautiful. In fact, I went in here with a friend of mine about 3 hours after it appeared, and I think we drank about 3 pints of water. I mean water. I know we're very famous for our beer. But it seems to suggest there was a kind of dehydrating effect going on, as if we were entering a kind of microwave oven. And of course, the human body is itself a lot of molecules of water in a state of vibration, so that's perhaps something to do with it. But after about a month of this thing being there, a lot of people actually experienced the opposite. They experienced heightened senses of well-being, almost as if, again, the energy changes and shifts over time. But the real reason why I put this up is because I then began to make a connection between the living sacred sites I'd been dowsing and the crop circles, purely on intuition. And in this particular case, what I found was that the physical design itself, which is limited to this particular area there, it had carrying with it 4 invisible energy rings. Again, just like ripples in a pond, but you couldn't see them. If you got up about 5 in the morning, and it was a lovely sunny morning, and you'd see the wheat backlit with all the dew resting on the wheat heads, you could actually see these rings of energy as a dark band resting on the actual water. It's very, very magical. But what I found was interesting after mapping the entire design, and this is a design which is about 400 feet across, was that, again, there's a relationship between the physical design, because by projecting the physical design outwards, it would start hitting at the exact points where this energy was. And when you projected them even further, you'd find that there were relationships all based on the harmonic principles of the pentagram. So this was a living organism I was playing with here, just like the needle of stone before it. The sacred geometry in the crop circle itself is imprinted into the ground, it's hit the ground, and it's vibrating outwards. In fact, there are people who would be passing by on the road nearby, which is about a good quarter of a mile, and you could not see this from the road, and they'd be picking up the energy of the design in their cars. So there's a sort of a biological effect going on here. So these things are generating their own organized energy fields, or so it seems. But and in fact here we have an interesting example of a 9-pointed star. Massive design, about 600 feet across. And what's happened here, because it looks unusual, what's happened is that the barley is actually raised off the ground. No one's actually been in this design. The plants haven't been completely killed by people trampling all over them. The plants, after about a week, have actually begun to raise along the nodes. And the nodes are the 3 knuckles on the plant, if you like. The plants were originally bent along the base, and then due to the action of the plant reacting to sunlight, it would react and raise itself like magic towards the sun on the last node nearest the head. So what you're seeing here is an actual embossed design of the original. Again, very magical. And there's a tumulus that actually generated the design. The energy pattern, sorry, the energy line would come along here. But in this particular example, what I wanted to point out is that the designs themselves, although while they might overtly show you a 9-pointed star, they also encode other energy relationships, because if you take this design apart, you'll find that the relationships, for example, of the thin ring there relative to its outer design, 12-pointed star. We have other relationships here defining this central circle to its perimeter as an equilateral triangle. When you get that, you get a 3-to-1 ratio. You get a double octave. So again, music. Again, this particular little thin line here, which is only about 3 inches wide in the field, relates to the outer edge as a pentagram. And again, a hexagram. Well, there's a lot of trouble to go to. If you're going to make this, if people are going to make this, you have to figure this stuff out in advance. Again, it doesn't seem to make any sense. But what we can do now is to start beginning to view the crop circles as types of temples, even physical expressions of a type of energy. So what type of energy could possibly be creating these? Now, I've been a musician for many, many years, and of course my natural inclination was to start thinking about sound. It's been a particular sort of thing of mine for many years. And it actually brought me to something that I was sort of born and raised with, which is, of course, religion. In particular, the words of the Bible that express the immortal words. In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word is God. In fact, it's so immortal that it's the one thing that every religion actually agrees on in the entire world. We can fight about everything else, but that at least we can agree on. Our Creator, whoever or whatever you think it is, expresses and creates the physical world through an expression, a movement of energy, a movement of sound. Well, I thought about sound and for quite many years, and as soon as I started doing it, it's almost as if the fields began to answer back, which is also something that happens very, very much in the crop circle phenomenon. There's this sort of co-creative process that goes on all the time. This particular one is a design that's a set of 4 heptagrams, 7-pointed figure, all nested within each other. And the heptagram esoterically is related to the pure notes of the white music scale, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. But there was something very unusual about this design. In fact, let me just bring that back a little bit. I'll tell you a little bit of a story. No, I want to go back. I want to go back. Thank you. I was in this particular design one afternoon with a couple of friends, and we heard some notes of music played at a very, very high pitch, almost as if like it was a loop, constantly playing, constantly playing. And we looked around for an ice cream van, which in England is very rare anyway, because it's always raining. And also because we're in the middle of nowhere, we're in the middle of farmland. So we can't see any ice cream vans anywhere, there's no one playing a ghetto blaster anywhere. We're the only people in the entire area, and these notes are everywhere. Now, as luck would have it, we had a tape recorder with us, and we recorded this high-pitched sort of set of notes of music. We took it to a local music store, plotted out these notes on a keyboard, and found out, yes, they were diatonic. I think it was, if my memory serves me correct, F, G, C. Played over and over and over and over and over. And we thought, that was fantastic, we've got music, we can now do something with this, we can find out what music is all about. Well, nothing really happened. In fact, I went back to my New Hampshire home at the time and got more puzzled by it as the months went by. And I went to the library one day, and again, as always happens in my life in this subject, books started falling out of the library at me. And one of them in particular fell onto this floor and showed itself in this diagram, which is actually the basis of that particular crop circle design. This is the heptagram with its lines connected. And it's a diagram that goes back to the Greeks. It's called the Web of Athena. And the story goes that the Web of Athena was meant to be taken where the entire design is constructed only of 3 line lengths. And the idea was to transpose these line lengths onto a stringed instrument, thereby creating a certain amount of notes. Well, I did this. I deputized my guitar and played it, and lo and behold, the same notes I'd heard in the crop circle could now be repeated on the guitar. Okay, well, now we have geometry as a harmonic expression of the energy. but so what? So took it to a next level, and I started looking at the actual expression of the physical design on the field itself. What if the actual energy pattern in the field also was an expression of music, or sound that was being generated by the crop circle? This is a Dowsing diagram I've made of that 9-pointed star, and again, all the black lines are ripples of energy permeating outwards, as much as a half a mile in diameter. Took quite a bit to compile, actually. Drove me absolutely nuts. But what I also found was that at the perimeter of this web of energy, there were like, within a space of about a foot, were about 32 lines of energy, as if the entire field was bouncing against this bell. I was entering this temple, if you like, this invisible temple. But what I actually did was plotted the actual dimensions of this bell relative to the edge of its physical design, and found that yes, there's a perfect equilateral triangle that could be inscribed in there. Well, we're back to music again, because this is a double octave. So what was going on here? Well, the story began to get a little bit more interesting, and again, music kept popping up, the sound thing kept popping up, and throughout the history of crop circle phenomenon, we find that the circle makers tend to drop a few hints that shouldn't be ignored, and they do this by making the crop circles decidedly different. And in this case, what happened here was that the plants weren't just bent at the soil level, they were actually bent 6 inches from the top. Now, you try walking in the field of barley and making 10,000 square feet of plants droop down from their heads. It's quite a feat, even if you're wearing pillars on your feet, as has been suggested on one occasion, but there you go. So here was a pattern that was basically telling us, we better take a look at this. There's something about the creative process behind crop circles here. And where I went with this was, it seemed to be very reminiscent of something called the cymatic pattern. And cymatics was basically something that was developed about 100 years ago by Margaret Watts Hughes in England, when she used to sing her voice into something called a tonoscope and create certain geometric shapes in powder. Well, in the 1960s, another bright, clever man, a Swiss scientist called Hans Jenny, he too decided to have a go at this principle of cymatics. And he started taking electronic equipment and throwing frequencies into liquid mediums. And what he got was these wonderful little shapes. This one, I think, is in water or glycerin. So this is actually a sound frequency that's being bombarded into a chamber filled with glycerin. So what Jenny essentially did in the 1960s was to help humanity visualize the music of the spheres, frozen music, if you like, and also its connection to geometry, the expression of the planetary motion up above. This is where things got very, very exciting, because now with the relationship to cymatics almost established, I started looking at the crop circle patterns and found that there was a relationship, a visual relationship going on between some of Hans Jenny's experiments and what was being laid down in the fields. But here was the best part. When looking at Jenny's research, I found that he started playing with very simple frequencies, and by doing so he would generate simple circles with simple rings, pretty much the same kind of shapes that we'd had in the crop circle phenomenon in the early days of the 1980s. But as Jenny started to bring up the frequency, he'd also started getting interesting shapes, very constructive shapes like tetrahedrons here, and mandalas. And we were starting to get mandalas too by the 1990s. There was a progression in the design. Well, that was kind of fun, because if we could determine the frequencies in the fields relative to the frequencies that were being administered in the laboratory setting, there could be a relationship going on here. Well, there was. A bright colleague of mine, and this is another one of Jenny's cymatic patterns, by the way. A good friend of mine called Paul Weige, who's a wonderful computer genius, and as coincidences go, just to sidetrack a little bit, at the time when I started doing this research, he was living in Portsmouth, Hampshire in England, and I was living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And we called each other up, because I felt that there was something about his work that I needed answers to, and he had the answers. And he calls me up and says, well, I think you might have some answers to the questions I've had for many years. So we got together, and he said, well, where do you live? And I said, well, I live in Portsmouth, New England. And he said, well, that's quite funny. I live in Portsmouth, Hampshire. Portsmouth, Hampshire. And he says, well, whereabouts do you live? And I said, well, I live on a road called Orchard Street. And he says, well, that's funny, because I can see Orchard Street right from here in Portsmouth, Hampshire. These are the kind of coincidences that happen throughout this phenomenon, and there are many, many of them. But Paul had been, he was actually a skeptic when he walked into this phenomenon, except that he'd been working with, looking at the resistivity of electromagnetism in plants. And one day his mother had given him some plants from samples of weeds, and he asked Paul to try them out and see if there was some kind of electrostatic frequency in any of the plants. Well, he found that some did and some didn't. And after trying the experiment blindfold many times, he found that there was something that was being grounded in the actual plants taken from a crop circle. So this aroused his curiosity to the point where he designed his own gizmo, and he'd walk up and down the field, up and down these little tram lines, the tractor lines that lie in our fields in England. He'd walk up and down the fields and he'd measure frequencies in the background. And there's always background frequencies around us. I mean, we live in this sort of electromagnetic soup. We have microwaves, we have radio waves, we have television, all kinds of things around us. And all of these generate certain frequencies. But what he found was when he actually crossed the perimeter of the crop circles, something happened. The frequencies either shot up or they dropped dramatically. And there was one particular set of frequencies that he kept finding in the crop circles in the mid-1990s. 260 megahertz to 320 megahertz. And we left it there for quite some time. And at this point, I came across Valerie Hunt's work on the human body. And she too had been mapping out the human body and all its range of frequencies. That the liver had a certain frequency, the eyeballs had a certain frequency. In fact, we were a map of frequency. But there was one particular range that was missing conspicuously in the entire human body. And that range was 360 to 320 megahertz. Exactly the same set of frequencies that Paul had been finding out in the crop circles themselves. This lasted for a good part of the 1990s. But what we also found in Paul's research was that as the 90s progressed towards 1998 and 99, the frequencies were shooting up to 640 megahertz, and the complexity of the crop circles was going up. Almost as if the complexity of the design seemed to match the rise in frequency. Well, that's funny, because Hans Jenny was finding the same thing in laboratories by bumping up the frequency and getting more complex geometric shapes. Around about the year 2000, we also came across something very unusual. In 3 particular crop circles, we found a frequency of 1.2 gigahertz, which takes us very close to the frequency of microwave. It's very rare. We've only found this about 3 times. But what was significant about 1.2 gigahertz was the fact that when SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, as you know, when they were trying to do the protocol for communicating with extraterrestrial life, they finally pinned down that the most easiest way to communicate with anyone would be to base it on the frequency of the most abundant element in the entire solar system, which is hydrogen. And hydrogen also has a frequency of 1.2 gigahertz. I'll let you draw your conclusions from that one. Now, interestingly, clairvoyants also maintain that it is the stepping up of frequency of vibration in the electromagnetic field which enables energy from another dimension to slip through as information, because it is by this process that changes in brainwave patterns occur. Now, that could be coming from a scientist in the modern era, but it was actually claimed by the famous psychic in 1902, Madame Blavatsky. How funny that we are now finding these kinds of things in the fields in England and throughout the world. This is my cat Pickle. Cute, huh? I just put that up for fun. You've got to have a sense of humor in all this. You can get a bit sort of gone with this. Lovely little creature. Right, back to the serious work. That's enough fun. The basis of the phenomenon, that wonderful bend in plants. And like I said, there's in the genuine crop circles, and the one thing that does define the genuine from the profane is the fact that there is no damage evident, particularly first thing in the morning if you are lucky enough to be the first one before many, many tourists come and admire them. And it's a bend which is even more incredible when you consider that it happens in canola, which is a plant which is very brittle and it's over an inch thick. And yet, we see fields of these things bent over as if these things have been steamed into place. In fact, in one day when I was a bit sort of in a hurry, and I didn't quite get permission to go into the field. And it's always polite to ask for permission to go into the fields because you are entering someone else's land. On one occasion I was a bit sort of careless, and I walked in. I was apprehended by one of Her Majesty's constables, to which I decided to get out of it by pointing to the police officer that if he should try to step on one of these upright plants with his very heavy boots, that he would actually snap the plants in half, which he did. And then I pointed out that the plants I was studying were doing this, to which he said, "God blimey, well, you think you're onto something, yeah? You better carry on." You got to try these things out. But anyway, at this point I thought, well, okay, what is it? There's some kind of conscious collaboration going on between the source of the crop circles and the natural elements, if it's doing this with complete collaboration. So I thought, well, let's find out if there are any relationships between the use of sound and its effect on plants. And well, there was. There's a wonderful book called The Secret Life of Plants, which I completely recommend. It's engrossing. It's absolutely a charming book. But in one of the pages of The Secret Life of Plants, there's a famous experiment by a woman in Boulder, Colorado, I believe, called Dorothy Vrtalak, who around about 1969 enrolled in college because she basically was bored. She didn't want to do macrame for the rest of her life when the kids left for college. And she decided to place all these plants in laboratory settings and expose them to music. Now, she left one set of plants alone, obviously, for the control sample. And then she went on to expose some plants to classical music, to heavy metal, and to a particular type of music played by Ravi Shankar, the famous Indian sitar player. Now, the experiments went on, as they usually do in laboratories, and she measured the plants and found that the ones that had been played classical music to, they'd actually leant towards the speakers and almost embraced them. They seemed to be enjoying this wonderful relationship with the music. The ones that had been exposed to Led Zeppelin were dead. It makes me wonder why I'm still alive. But the ones where Ravi Shankar's music had been played to, the plants had actually they'd bent over 60 degrees to the horizontal, and actually in some cases embraced the very speakers from which the music was coming out. So there was something very unusual about the music of Ravi Shankar that was having an unusual effect, and probably the closest any human has ever achieved to creating this. So I thought, well, what is it about the type of music that Ravi plays that has this resonant effect? Well, Ravi Shankar plays a particular type of music called raga, not reggae. And raga is basically Indian devotional song. Now, Indian devotional song is very sacred music. And in fact, like its written counterpart, Sanskrit, and also Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, these are expressions which are actually unalterable by law. If you try to alter any of the tones of Indian devotional song, or any of the writings of Sanskrit, or the Hebrew alphabet, your hands will be cut off. Not too dissimilar to the ancient church, but for better reasons, because these were supposed to be the vestiges of the expressions of the words of God. Well, no wonder they were so sacred, and why a lot of trouble was taken to try and preserve this information, which is very, very holy. So again, the connection to music and sound kept coming up. In this particular field, we have what in one level can be seen as the hieroglyph of divine vibration. You can see the pursed lips there, and also the expression of movement coming out of the side of the lips. If you're a biophysicist or even a biologist, you can also see that it's also resembling the centrosome of the human cell. And it's quite funny because both expressions probably are very correct. And again, it's showing how the relationship between sound and the biological system are very well intertwined. It's a very efficient way of communicating information by having so much in one element. By this time, we'd also accumulated many incidences where other forms of sound were heard in crop circles. In fact, they were taped. This was the famous trilling noise that was taped by Colin Andrews, George Wingfield, and other researchers. And it was a noise that was actually taken to the laboratory in England for analysis, and then also taken to the Jet Propulsion Laboratories at NASA for analysis by Robert Weiss, who was the guy who did the Watergate tapes. So he's obviously, quite kosher. And it was found out that after relating the trilling noise of the crop circles to every available form of bird, it was found that there was no bird that created this noise, and it was a noise that was being created by some kind of mechanical movement. Not only that, but it was also a noise that had a frequency of 5 kilohertz. So what was so important about 5 kilohertz? Was this the famous sound that created all the crop circles? Well, if you again go back to some of these studies that were done all the way back to the Second World War, using sound to raise the resistivity of plants to all kinds of things, and particularly to enhance the growth of plants, because during the war obviously there was a food shortage, and no method was spared to try and induce plants to grow faster. Some of the experiments that the Russians, the Canadians and the American government did was to throw sound frequency at wheat, and of course they found too that by throwing 5 kilohertz at wheat, you'd induce the plants to grow faster. Now this is quite interesting, because a lot of the farmers who've had crop circles on their land also tell you that their plants have also had an acceleration of growth. In fact, the following year after crop circles have been on your land, and you've ploughed the field, you reseeded it, there are some cases where the actual seeds that are now lying on what used to be the old crop circle have actually raised above the level of the local field. Very magical. I've actually tried doing this at home as well in an experiment to figure out if this could be reproduced just in my backyard. And I've taken plants from crop circles which I have, to my satisfaction, I've deemed to be genuine. And I've placed them next to control samples and found that after about 2 weeks, the control samples are about so big, running off the ground, and the ones that I've taken from crop circles are about so big. And this is just in 2 weeks. And I was hoping to have some pictures here, but my rabbit ate them. There is no shortage of funding in this phenomenon, I tell you. Oh dear. Of course, I do have an 8-foot rabbit now as well, but that's okay. Well, what kind of sound, to cut a very long story short, would be capable of doing these crop circles? Well, at this point I started getting more involved into into ultrasound. And ultrasound does some very, very interesting things. This is sound way and above the human level of hearing, the kind of thing that dogs pick up and birds pick up. And I found that ultrasound does very interesting things. For example, the higher the frequency of ultrasound, the greater its ability to form complex patterns. Well, that's fun, because the higher the frequencies we're getting year by year, the more complex the patterns are becoming too. So there was one connection to ultrasound right there. It has a historical rise in frequency relative to the pattern designs. The interesting thing about ultrasound is that also its frequencies also damage sensitive electronic equipment, and there is no shortage of stories, and I'm talking hundreds of stories, and particularly cases involving the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, where they take £35,000 cameras, equivalent to about $50,000 video cameras, and it's the moment that they actually cross the threshold of the crop circle that they get a very agonizing ray of red light, after which time these very expensive pieces of machinery are rendered obsolete. I know a pilot who flies helicopters to take up people to look at the crop circles, and so many times has he had problems with his equipment flying over the airspace of crop circles that he refuses to do it anymore. There have been cases where microlight pilots have flown over them and their engines have completely cut out, and so far, luckily, no one's actually been hurt, which is quite amazing. But the energy inside crop circles also is capable of polarizing liquid crystal displays to the point where if you walk in with a watch with a liquid crystal display and you turn 90 degrees, it will go black, it will polarize. Again, this would be an effect concordant with ultrasound. And of course, the one I really enjoy is the fact that it's capable of wiping the magnetic strip on credit cards. So if you want to do some shopping, go to the mall first and then the crop circle. Can get very expensive. Ultrasound can also be focused like a light beam to create some very fine detail. Here's an example of something that happened back in 1988, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a 600-foot diameter circle. Very, very big thing indeed. And you see here that these little orbital rings, like the electrons around an atom, these things are about the width of 2 to 3 wheat heads. I mean, that's about this much. You couldn't even have a small child walking sideways to create that kind of effect. And look at the fine detail here, all these radial lines bursting out from the center. 76 of them, I believe. Here you have the bit where people actually walked in to actually measure the circle. You can see the damage created, and you see the damage that they also caused trying to get in and out. So that's human involvement there, but actually done by researchers going in to measure the thing. But you can see what's happened here is that there's this embossed effect taking place, as if you have a section of plants about so wide, where the plants have actually been bent a certain height off the ground along one of the nodes, and the plants in another segment along it have been raised along the second node of the plant. So you have this sort of seesaw effect going on. Now that's very, very focused intent right there. Again, this is something that could be created with a light beam of a type used by ultrasound. Now ultrasound, the psychological effects from crop circles also suggests ultrasound is at work, because the megahertz range affects brainwave patterns and also, surprise, surprise, is capable of altering awareness. By this, I'm talking about the fact that frequencies in the megahertz range are capable of vibrating the pineal gland, which sits behind the eye, and it's by this process that the two ventricles of the brain connect, and basically what happens is that you have heightened states of awareness when you do so. It's almost like a chemical reaction that's taking place. Ultrasound also prevents damage to sensitive tissues, and we know this because we now use it in healing in hospitals. Well, this is fun because the Aborigines knew this over, so they claim, about 15,000 years ago. And the stories out of Australia by the Aborigines, and there have been eyewitnesses to this, people have actually had compound fractures while out running in the outback. And the Aborigines, what they do is they run the didgeridoo, their wonderful little instrument that's made from a hollowed tree limb. They play the didgeridoo over the affected limb where the broken bones are. And after 3 days, compound fractures actually heal. Now, this was thought to be a bit sort of weird until it was discovered that by analysing the didgeridoo, it too has ultrasonic frequencies, just like the kind of type that we use in hospitals. But they also have something more interesting, a little piece of wood that they put to it with a string and they whirl around their heads, and they call this a bora. And it makes a trilling noise not unsimilar to the crop circle trilling noise. And when the crop circle noise was played to them, they actually were very surprised. They said, "Oh, that sounds just like the kind of noise we do." So we asked, "Well, why is it that you do this noise? Why do you sort of whirl this thing around? Is it just for fun?" And they said, "No, we do this to contact the sky spirits." It was since discovered that crop circles in Australia have appeared near Aboriginal sacred sites. And to really edge the bet, it was also found that they have many petroglyphs which have the same kinds of symbols that we can match to the early crop circle designs. So all of this is all connected. And of course, to make the ultimate connection, ultrasound has been measured at stone circles throughout England, particularly at the point of just before sunrise, 4 to 5 in the morning, which ironically is not too far from the time when most of the crop circles have been witnessed appearing. There have been crop circles that have been seen appearing in daylight, very rare occasions, but most of them seem to appear between 2 and 4 in the morning, which ironically happens to be also the time when the Earth's electromagnetic field is at its lowest ebb, which means that you have a window out of which things can escape and things can enter. And we know that 95% of all deaths that happen in hospitals also happen between 2 and 4 in the morning. Interesting stuff indeed. But here's the fun part I really enjoy. Ultrasound also scares birds. Now you might think, what on earth has this got to do with crop circles? Well, in this particular field at Hackpen Hill, which actually Hackpen means the snake's head, which is a relationship to the earth energy that actually happens to cross this particular site. About 4 years before this magnificent design appeared, this field had received many crop circle designs, and in that particular year, Arthur C. Clarke, the famous novelist, decided to try his hand at crop circles and expose the entire thing as a fraud. And I think this was done for the Discovery Channel in this country many years ago. And he hired 5 people, local artists, to make a crop circle in daylight. It took them about 2 days to make a 60-foot flower design, which actually qualifies as the world's longest developing crop circle, because we know from 80 eyewitnesses around the world that they appear within 15 seconds. Now, Arthur was very pleased with his project, and it did look quite nice. I mean, it was a nice little, pretty little flower, even though all the plants are all obviously crushed and damaged beyond recognition. But he was very impressed, and he got the farmer and he said, well, here you are, conclusive proof that it's all made by people, we can do it, haha. Well, the farmer, he's a very old-fashioned kind of guy. He actually is one of these people that looks at the way the plants are budding, the way the sky is moving, and he can tell you that it's going to rain exactly 5 millimeters on April the 15th, the year 2010. And he'd always be right. He'd also paid attention to what was happening in the crop circles on his land prior to this event, and he said, well, no, this is not the same thing, because in your case, you've just downed all these plants, and all the birds and the local dogs are already in the circle eating the plants. And he said, well, what's the big deal with that? And he said, well, quite frankly, when the real ones appear, I'll watch the birds breaking formation above the crop circle and connecting their formation at the end of it. In fact, none of the birds I ever see, even with the plants downed in crop circles, ever go into them to pick up the wheat, which is right there ready for eating. And of course, what do we use ultrasound for in the modern era at airports? We use it to scare away birds. That's what I thought. Let's go to the opposite end of the range, as if that wasn't enough. We go into infrasound, and this is where things get very interesting. I showed at the beginning a picture of the chromosomes being altered in a crop circle. This is another one. This is the crystalline structure of a crop circle plant down here. After exposure to the crop circle energy, this is a normal wheat sample. Again, clearly different. There's a kind of harmonizing effect that's taken place by the energy. Well, if we look at the infrasound, which occurs at 20 hertz, which is way, way below the human threshold of hearing, we find that it actually disrupts physical substances and can alter chromosomes. This is straight out of a medical laboratory manual. But the fun thing about infrasound is that it has an amazing acoustic power, and it creates heat. In fact, in 1 nanosecond, it has been known to boil water. Well, this is very relevant now, because we find that when we take samples of crop circle plants, the plants have been charred at the base, superficial charring. And also here at the node, you see how the node is elongated, but it's also been darkened by some kind of heating effect. And yet the plants are still perfectly fine, they're alive and well. Well, this is something that would be capable of being induced by infrasound, because obviously if you have an element which is capable of boiling water, when you boil the water, as you do in a kettle, the water has to expand. And when it expands, it has to go somewhere. And when it's in an enclosed system, such as a plant, it comes out of this tiny little hole that has suddenly been created in the node. This is an expulsion cavity, just like the film Alien, where William Hurt gets an additional extra that comes out of his body. This is what's happening in the crop circle plants. The water boils, it escapes, and it does so in the form of vapor. And the few farmers that have seen crop circles first thing in the morning, the first thing that they notice is that there's a lot of vapor actually coming out and steam coming out of the plants themselves. But this heating effect happens, as I said, in 1 nanosecond. It's a very, very rapid process. And this kind of seems to tie in with, like I said, 80 of the world's eyewitnesses who have seen crop circles forming. These are reports that go back right up to the 1960s in our modern era. One very famous case that would back this up was a time in 1989, at a time when there was a great excitement throughout the British media about crop circles. Things were very, very upbeat. And a couple of years before the hoax sort of angle entered the public domain, 2 years before Doug and Dave popped up, Nippon TV, which is the national television of Japan, they decided to mount some cameras on top of a place called Bratton Castle, which is an old Iron Age hill fort, a place of sacred worship for at least 3,000 years. They did this with cooperation from a lot of scientists, and also the army were present to monitor the fields below, just in case something would happen. Well, in this 2-week project where this hilltop stakeout was watching the local fields, after the second day, when all the researchers went home, crop circle appeared first thing in the morning. During a night when the army was also suspiciously absent. The net effect, to cut a very long story short, was that the world's media, who'd been present for the whole thing, had basically been duped, because when the researchers ran down to the center of the crop circle, which looked like a complete mess actually close up, they found that at the center of each of the circles a horoscope game and a wooden cross. Now, who on earth carries with them 6 horoscope games and wooden crosses? Unless, of course, there was some kind of fun that was being played with the world's media. And that's what happened, because this event was put on breakfast television, and the whole thing was exposed as a great big fraud. Well, what the Japanese did, since they'd come all the way over from Japan, was that they stayed on the stakeout, and they kept filming night after night after night. And right at the very end of the 2-week stakeout, right at the very edge of the limitation of the film equipment, they actually captured a 15-second swirl motion in the crop, like a question mark. Fun stuff. The outcome was that because of their contractual obligation, Nippon TV had to hand over the film cartridge to the BBC for analysis. And here's a broadcasting corporation that is renowned for its perfection and its wonderful system, and they lost the tape. So the public never got to see it, but wonderfully the Japanese managed to keep a few copies and gave it to the researchers. So it does exist in one form or another. It's a video that was done by John McNeish, his first video, which I don't think you can actually get anymore. But it does exist in the public realm now. So there we have that wonderful rapid process going on in the crop circle creation. So taking this scenario, could the crop circles be influencing the people who come into contact with them, and even the energy grid of the Earth itself? Well, I'd have to say yes. I think there is an interaction going on here. For one thing, people have actually witnessed beams of light connecting with the ground and creating crop circles, or leaving some kind of energy print that generates a crop circle within 48 hours after its appearance. I was actually one such lucky person, and I don't know if you can see this. It's very dim. There is a better copy of this picture in my book at the back if you want to take a better look at it. But if you can just make out 2 straight beams of light hitting the landscape right there below the horizon, one there and one there. Straight beams. Now, I've been a professional photographer for 20 years, and I can tell you that to get beams out of sunlight, you have to shoot at the sun. This picture was shot across the Pewsey Vale, where I live in Wiltshire, and the sun at the time was sort of over here by about another 30 degrees. It was late afternoon, about 3 o'clock. So clearly, there's no way I could have captured the sun in any way, shape, or form. But I took the film to Kodak, and I said, well, what's going on here? Because the film clearly isn't fogged. It's not going through the entire film. And it's clearly occurring within the actual frame of the negative, which is right here, not above it. And it's hitting just below the horizon. And I said, well, you've obviously captured something, some beams of light of some kind, some sunlight. And I said, well, that's impossible. The sun was way over some other place. And I didn't really think too much about it, apart from the fact that I'd captured beams of light on tape, on film, and I hadn't even seen them when I'd photographed them, which is even more bizarre. Now, a couple of days went by, and I was sitting down at the pub, as one that usually does in the course of research, and I was approached by this lady, a local lady, who actually didn't know me, and I hadn't actually discussed who I was or anything. I just got into polite conversation. And she was very kind enough to volunteer a piece of information, which is very personal. And she said, well, you might think I'm crazy, but 2 days ago, I was out walking my dog by a little forest called Torsmead Copse. And about 3 in the afternoon, this tube came straight out of the clouds, parted the clouds, and descended upon the field with the wheat, and just swirled around for about 15 seconds and went back up again. I thought, well, thank you very much, because at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was filming a beam of light descending on here, which is exactly the place where Torsmead Copse is. And the second beam of light now will be able to correlate to a local sacred site. So we have a little bit of information there which seems to correlate itself. There's been at least 10 eyewitnesses that I know of who have seen these beams of light actually forming crop circles in front of them, again dating all the way back to 1960, suggesting that there is some kind of imprinting going on. Now, since we're talking about light, the light spectrum carries the signals that human DNA requires for receiving its information. And data taken from this particular and very bizarre crop circle, and this is the research of Greg Braden, by the way, if you want to follow up on this. The data taken from this particular crop circle appears to match strategic breaks in human DNA which are unused or waiting to be coded. Now, such bioelectromagnetic signals operate at the extreme ends of the electromagnetic spectrum, the type of frequencies which we record in crop circles, if you remember. So any excitation of this bioelectromagnetic field is transmitted to DNA, and in laboratory experiments, genetic information has already been successfully transmitted from one organism to another. So if there is a coding going on, it's quite suggestive that it already is taking place, and hence why people are possibly having heightened senses of awareness in relationship to crop circles. It's actually influencing the very DNA itself. And of course we go back to the beginning. Like I said, we have measurable changes to the local energy grid after crop circles appear. We also know from the research by Colin Andrews that 4%, the magnetic field shift of 4% has taken place in at least 20% of the cases that he's personally analysed over the years, suggesting that there's something going on with the actual gravitational field, because once you start playing with the magnetic field, you need to start looking at what's happening on the ground. And as I said earlier, we have cases where the roots are not pointing downwards towards the center of gravity, they're actually pointing sideways. And you can only do that, technically, if the local gravitational field has been affected in some way. Well, of course, this is all highly theoretical, although given the ground evidence, it seems more than unlikely that, this is not happening. But if you have a change in the local gravitational field, then you're going to influence time. And we also now know, as I said before, that experiments have been done with digital clocks where time is missing in crop circles. And it's not just the clocks themselves, it's the people who walk into them. And many cases have I known where my friends and I have gone into the crop circles to just take a quick look, just 5 minutes. And we go back to our very unamused wives. 3 hours later, or in my case, ex-wife. So clearly there's something going on here. And of course, the other piece of evidence is the fact that all this gravitational stuff, all this magnetic field shift stuff is having its resonant effect on electromagnetic equipment, which is way beyond doubt. If you ever take a full pack of batteries into a crop circle, leave it outside, I cannot tell you the amount of times when we've been, particularly when we're being interviewed for television, where actually Paul this year had a very funny incident where they're trying to find out how his little gizmo works in crop circles, and he'd load it up with batteries and go, well, it works like this. No, it doesn't. I'll put some new batteries in. He puts new batteries in. Within 15 seconds, they're dead. I mean, he lost equivalent to about $40 worth of batteries in half a day. Everything was dead. And they had interference on their electronic equipment. Part of the interviews were missing. All kinds of weird interference bars were going on. Bizarre stuff. And of course, there's all the effect on the planes that go over them. Electronic equipment shuts out in the planes, gyroscopes go astray, and compasses fail to locate magnetic north. Very irritating stuff indeed. And finally, consider that crop circles, like churches and sacred spaces, also appear along strategic energy points on the Earth's electromagnetic grid. They appear to be formed by a combination of sound and electromagnetism. They are encoded with sacred geometry. And all such vibrations have a sympathetic effect on molecular structures because all the molecules that make up the physical world, including the human body, are all in a state of vibration. Here we have the famous Silbury Hill. You can't get a bigger sacred site than that. Well, before I conclude, I wanted to thank all the people who basically brought me here, all the people at MUFON. There's so many names here, I can't even begin to tell you all the names, but it's always so important to honor these people because it's by this way that we get all this information out. Otherwise it stays in our heads and it doesn't get anywhere. So if I really could have a round of applause for all the people who do hold MUFON together, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. If I haven't managed to fry everybody's brain yet, the references are in my book. There are a few copies at the back for sale if anybody wants some. Please take a look at some of the pictures if you can't see them quite clearly on the screen. I'm going to leave you with one last thing to think about, a little piece of homework. I mean, it is Easter. It's only Easter. I mean, there's got nothing better to do. Crop circles, churches, sacred sites, all connected to water in some meaningful way. This is where we end up back at the beginning, when I was talking about how the sites were always influenced by some way with water. This is an infrared photograph I shot of a new crop circle showing how the water table has been completely sucked out of the ground. This is completely bone dry. It had been raining the night before, and despite the fact that all this field is completely muddy, inside this area it's bone dry. Millions of gallons of water suddenly vanished, as if superheated, taken out. Well, we know that spin creates an electromagnetic field in water, and water has memory. We now know this because a famous French scientist called Jacques Benveniste decided to test the idea that homeopathy had something going for it. And when he did, and he finally proved that this was the case, and his work was actually validated by 5 different laboratories all across Europe, we know he was right because his laboratory was raided by the French authorities, and they confiscated his equipment and his notes. As we know, this is a modern way of figuring out that you're actually on the right path of inquiry. Which reminds me, I'm not wearing my Kevlar jacket. But this is where the homework comes in. Consider that researchers such as Lucy Pringle have been they've been leaving bottles of water, burying them in crop circles and removing them and sending them to Jacques Benveniste in France. And Jacques finds that the samples taken in crop circles are actually being coded up to 151%. Now again, this validates the fact that some kind of energy is actually imprinting itself into the water, which is where the implication comes in. 95% of the world's reported crop circles appear in southern England. Southern England sits on the world's deepest chalk aquifer. All this water is being encoded. It's going through the aquifer, it's going underground, it's going into our rivers, and it's going into the oceans and the seas all around the world. And here's the best part, because the homeopathic effect, the more diluted the original solution, the more powerful it becomes. So if crop circles are encoding the oceans, and the oceans occupy 2/3 the body of the planet, consider how they might be transforming the human body, which itself is also 2/3 water. I hope this has been very transformational for you as well. Thank you very much for having me again. Thank you.
Freddy.
Thank you.
Back here, and I just wanted to ask all of our questioners. We have a question and answer period. Do you need a break at this point, or you want to?
No, we'll go on.
Okay. Okay. Anybody who wants to ask a question so that it tracks on this tape, please come to the microphone here behind our video man, Dennis Whipple.
Hi, Freddy.
Hello.
Could you describe your description of dowsing in a way that you were able to come up with the circular rings of energy? Could you describe how physically you do that? Do you actually walk around in a perfect circle for all of those rings?
What happens is that I use copper rods, and now I actually just use my hands. You become very sensitive to what's there after a while. But what I do is, because you have the straight lines, let's see if I go back one. Well, all those little tram lines is where the tractor ruts go. So what you essentially do is, you do this. You walk up and down and map it from one area to the other, which gives you basically a center point. And you basically map out the points where you actually have an energy impact on the rods. In other words, they close, telling me that there's something there, depending on what I'm asking them, by the way. So I plot them down on the ground along those tram lines, measure them from the center stake, and just plot outwards to the north, to the south. And then if I'm lucky, at the point where the harvest is taking place and the shape is still there, I go west and east, so I get a triangulation in 4 ways. But what I've since come to find is that the eccentricity from the center, north, south, east, west, there's only about 6 inches discrepancy in eccentricity. So I've just started doing measurement up and down, which gives me an almost perfect circular feature. That's pretty much how I do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Otherwise I'd be damaging all the crop all around here, which gets me into a lot of trouble.
The other sort of circular related question I had was on your chart of the planetary orbits and the relationships. The planet's orbits aren't circular, so you said mean orbits. Is that how you account for that?
Yeah, they take the eccentricity of the orbits in both ways and arrive at a mean distance, which is perfectly circular, which they still figured out is 99.5% accurate, which is quite amazing. But that's how they do it, yes, because you're quite right, because everything is elliptical. But the mean orbit takes both ends of the spectrum and uses it as one element.
Freddy, I'm going to man your book table behind us for those of you who are leaving early and would like to purchase a copy of Freddy's book. Can you give us the price on it, and I'll man that for you?
$19.95.
Okay.
And there's a 5 cents. Just help yourself from the cup.
Okay. There you have it, folks. I'll be back at the table.
Near these sites of these crop circles, have you witnessed any alien UFO abductions, or seen any evidence of underground alien bases near these crop circles?
My only contact with any form of UFO activity has been actually in the form of balls of light. Which, from what I understand from either psychics or scientists, are either expressions of forms of energy or consciousness. Or I think it was Jacques Vallée that did some research on the fact that when you see balls of light that step down in color frequency, that they're actually at a point where they're slowing down at a rate of vibration to the point where they physicalize. Now, the only contact I've had has actually been with balls of light, which are about so big. I've actually videotaped them on one occasion, about 15 of them, during a 15-minute period with 3 witnesses. That's only been my experience. I haven't seen any sort of aliens or any other kind of life form. There is one occasion when I actually did meditate in one crop circle around about midnight, and I did see, without ruining the book too much, I was sort of, I experienced some levitation, and I do remember coming into contact with about 6 very, very, very tall beings, and very benevolent. I mean, it was a wonderful experience which I'll never forget. And this is someone talking as an atheist that then believed in God after that. It was a very wonderful experience, so that's been my experience of that. I've also had one experience when I was flying in a microlight, which is basically a hang glider with a Volkswagen engine strapped to the back and a few million gallons of highly combustible fuel, which I totally recommend, by the way. And we were talking about this very same thing, about balls of light, and my pilot was saying, I don't believe in any of this nonsense. And at that point, a sphere, a silver sphere, which we saw during daylight, actually passed 100 feet below us this way. And it was just like a cartoon. There was two of us just went... And I'm banging his helmet. I'm going, follow that ball, that sphere. And I'm going, I'm out of fuel. Shoot a photograph. I haven't got any more film. Just keep going after it. I want to land. But that was quite funny. And it was just going about its normal daily routine and about his own business. But the funny thing was, we saw it at a place called Golden Ball Hill, which local folklore always says that this is a place where light beings and balls of light are always seen going into the mountain and emerging out of it. But other than that, nothing else.
Oh, but have you ever seen any of these balls of light or alien beings near these Gothic cathedrals, like looking around near these Gothic cathedrals?
Not to my knowledge, but they have seen the balls of light hovering around the sites of stone, like stone circles and stone needles. But I don't think I know of any records around the Gothic cathedrals, no.
Thank you. And neither have you seen them around in churches?
Haven't seen them in churches, no.
Okay, thank you
some people
very
have claimed to have seen apparitions, which they would call the Holy Spirit, which are very similar to balls of light, but that hasn't been my experience.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent, upbeat talk. On the dark side of this phenomena, the human crop circle makers, the response of the government, academia. Any comments you want to make on this subject, given the brief amount of time left, would be appreciated.
On the human circle makers and academia and the government. It's a hard one to prove, the connection, because government always works in secret. I do know a friend of mine who actually is a cadet in the British military, and he does it just get some exercise with some friends. He actually managed to infiltrate one of the hoaxer gangs and found that they're actually being paid a lot of money to go about putting forgeries in fields, and most of the time just to throw people like me off the scent and stretch us to the absolute limit. Apart from that, there's the connection, or the supposed connection, that a couple of the hoaxes around 1992, this would be Jim Schnabel, who is on record as supposedly being part of the CIA, which I don't know, maybe he was saying it as a joke, I don't know, and Robert Irving, who had supposedly connections to the British military intelligence. Those would be the most tangible connections, and there was a famous tape that was made of a man who pretended to be a business interest back in '93, I believe, and he actually phoned Jim Schnabel to say that he would be interested in finding out about the human circle makers, how to get involved with the debunking, and it is on tape, on record, that Schnabel said that there is that the American, British and German governments are involved in the debunking of the crop circle phenomenon and the human circle makers, as well, in relationship to this talk, the Vatican. Can we substantiate this? I don't know. It's all hearsay, but it seems quite like it that there are efforts being involved to make people sort of be thrown off the scent and waste our resources examining things which were man-made. So it's almost like you're putting in forgeries in order to falsify the evidence, but that still doesn't devalue the fact that there's still original things that are happening. I mean, a hoax is a forgery, and a forgery requires an original thing from which to copy. So yes, very difficult to prove. That's about the best I can do. I do know that there are black military helicopters that do study the crop circles, and I've seen them at close quarters, 30 feet from the ground. And there's no reason why helicopters should be hovering 30 feet from the ground in an area that makes bread.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You were doing the geometry within the crop circle and its energy lines around it. Have you done some geometry in relationship to the crop circle's placement with the holy sites? Are there geometry relationships between the holy sites and the crop circles?
Excuse me. Hello. It's a man in black. It really is.
All right, I'll be stuck back over here. Sorry about that.
Oh, they've come to get me. My visa is in order, honest officer. I think there were some people that were doing it back in the 1990s, but I don't think they took it to any considerable degree, because the distances that you were dating them to are so vast. What I have done is found that there are certain strategic ratios, geometric ratios, that are actually encoded into the crop circle relative to the local sacred sites. Not a specific geometry, but an angle. And I know that two other researchers also did this before me, and I didn't know this at the time when I was doing the research, so it's kind of referencing in a way. And if you want more information on this, it's in a book called 2/3 by David Percy and David Myers. And what we've come up with is the fact that in some relationships, the actual crop circle design is aligned to local sacred sites at 19.47 degrees. Now you might think, so what? Well, 19.7 degrees also happens to be the point on Earth, the latitude on Earth, where our energy point is. It's the Hawaiian Islands. And at this point, there's an upwelling of energy that comes out of the planet. But the funny thing is, it also happens on Venus, on Mars, and on Jupiter, hence the red spot. There's that strategic rotation. So perhaps that's the closest I've found in terms of a geometric ratio that exists in relationship to the sacred sites, yes.
That 19 point whatever is also found in the pyramids.
Yes.
The relationship with the sacred sites in Egypt seem to have relationships with the stars. They're like a picture of the
That's right.
constellations on the ground. And I was wondering if England had similar relationships.
Yes, it does. The tumuli that I showed at the beginning, and the sacred sites, the mounds, there are many which actually are mirrors of entire constellations. Again, because the ancients believed that by bestowing the order of the heavens on Earth, they could receive, beneficial effects. And one of those such constellations, which is actually not too far from my house, is the exact configuration of the system Lyra. One of the long barrows is actually related to Vega, and it's all a mirror image of the heavens. So yes, it is in the landscape.
You mentioned at one point that the temperature somehow was measured inside of crop circles of being 5,000 degrees centigrade. I was wondering if you could expand on that some. How was that detected?
It was detected by, it was actually written about recently in several magazines, and this was by a physicist up in the University of New Hampshire, I believe, who has done research on, and also there's one here in California, and off the top of my head I don't recall, but they actually took soil samples and took a look at the evidence of what was happening in the soil and found that the only way to change the elements and the composition of the elements in the soil inside the crop circles would be by having a heating degree to about 5,000 degrees in a flash of a second. That's how they determined it.
In a flash of a second, not to the point where it could ignite the actual contents of the circle then?
No, there was only a superficial charring of the plants. That's why they said that it had to happen in such a short burst of time. Otherwise, any longer period of time, the crop would have blown up and caught fire.
Unlike anybody else I've heard kind of on this subject, I've not heard anybody relating where there were witnesses of crop circle formations. There's a rather famous film that came out 2 or 3 years ago of this actually in process. I was wondering if you can tell me what witnesses do describe when they're witnessing a crop circle being formed in front of them.
Yeah. Are you referring to the Oliver's Castle video? Which shows
I think there's only one. Is there more than one?
Balls of light actually creating a crop circle.
Yeah. Have you seen any more films other than that?
No. And you've got to be aware that that was actually a fraud. I mean, they were actually caught. There's a whole story in the whole book about.
What do authentic people who actually see this describe then?
The authentic people, we're talking about 80 here, they have described either a swirl motion happening by itself in a field. They've seen tubes of light or beams of light, depending on whether you see them during the day or during the night, come out of the clouds and just rotate the crop in right before their eyes, or they'll see a tube of light come down where 48 hours later the formation appears. Or they've also seen balls of light after the event circling around the actual design itself. And in one case, there was a group of people in the East Field in, let's see, in England, that actually saw a massive ball of light with two that came out of it swirl around the sky, project beams of light into the ground, and then at 4 in the morning, about 3 hours later, crop circle then appeared. So that's the kind of range of eyewitness reports that we've had.
Did you mention at one point you had seen something like this? I remember you were telling me, just talking about recently, the friend and you watching a red ball of light pass by. Was that your experience in such things?
I've seen the beams of light. I photographed the beams of light coming down at the time when 48 hours later that crop circle appeared on the very same spot. I've seen the balls of light just dancing around an existing crop circle, and they were actually videotaped. I mean, you can't see much because it was the middle of the night, but you can just sort of see them flickering. But that's been the experience, yes.
Hi, Freddy.
Hello.
First of all, I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and
Pleasure.
And especially your experiences with the alien beings that you a little bit ago mentioned. My question is, have you ever heard of these formations or these manifestation crop circles about appearing in the Arctic or North Pole in the ice, any of that?
Yeah, recently there's been a huge surge in reports from Canada of ice circles and snow circles. There was one back in '92 in Afghanistan, which was actually found by a British expedition from Cambridge. So that's quite a fun. But it's the ice circles which seem to be the new phenomenon, and there's no real way of figuring out if it's part of the same phenomenon, but it's suddenly anomalous, for sure. They're not perfectly circular again, they're slightly elliptical. There have also been cases where concentric rings have been found in the frozen Charles River in Boston, right outside Harvard. And this is a time when the ice is so thick so you can't really walk on it, and a light coating of snow.
Right.
So there have been cases, yes, where they are beginning to appear on ice. Whether it's the same phenomenon, we don't know because there's no way of measuring it.
Right. Just out of curiosity. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Yes, there is an interesting geometrical fact on that 19.7 degrees. If you take a pyramid with a triangular base, a tetrahedron, if you will,
Yeah.
and the tip of it's at the North Pole, the other 3 points intersect 19.7 below the...
Latitude, yeah.
Yes, and I'm not sure what that means, but it is an interesting coincidence, if nothing else.
Thank you.
how is the water being encoded? Is it like a snowflake crystal structure, or what are they seeing with this water?
They measure it energetically. That's what Ben Venice sort of does with the molecules. He just finds that there's a sort of 151% increase in the energy of the water. There's also been a case of Dr. Schweitzer, I think, who in London, who actually took samples from the water samples from the crop circles and put them under the microscope as a crystalline form, and he's frozen the water and put it under a slide, and found that the actual shape of the crop circle is then geometrically embedded in the crystalline pattern of that water.
The recent crop circles that have showed up in the Americas, particularly, don't seem to be relating to underground water aquifers or anything like that. So if the crop circles are encoding water, why are these strange burn mark-like crop circles appearing in America?
Well, the majority of the crop circles in the States actually happen in the prairie up in Canada by the border. And the thing to point out about that is the fact that they appear on limestone. Now, limestone is the chemical twin of chalk. And you have the huge aquifer that sits in the central plains in America, even though it's beginning to be dried out. And yes, there are some cases up in Washington State and Oregon, where I think some of them have happened where they don't seem to relate to anything at all. But no, there is a possibility that we have to be open to that there are other beings, people, whatever, also creating additional crop circles using similar technology but putting them in other places. Again, could be for distraction or for reasons that we just don't know. But there was that famous case in the 1991 in the Alva Desert in Oregon, where there was a Sri Yantra, which is basically a Hindu mandala of great complexity, 13.3 miles of lines etched into a desert floor where there used to be water. And it was found 2 days after a flyby by one of the local Air Force pilots at Idaho. So quite a lot of achievement to do. But yeah, that would be the connection. The limestone would be the main connection in the Great Plains aquifer.
Hi, when there's a crop circle near a religious structure, does that ever repeat? Do you ever get a new crop circle around that structure? And if so, how often? And do hoaxers build them around religious structures too?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. They appear sporadically. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason when they appear. Avery, for example, seems to get one every couple of years. It seems to be sporadic. They're either near churches or sacred sites or stone monuments. They come and go. Some years it's 5 years before you see another one near them, but they'll always be near sacred sites. Now, when the connection was made and written up about and published, then the hoaxers decided that in order to have some fun with us, then they started locating theirs next to the sacred sites. Because originally when Doug and Dave were saying that they made all the world's crop circles, and they'd said that they'd made the entire phenomenon in the county of Hampshire, it turns out that most of the crop circles up till then had been in Wiltshire, which has a greater amount of sacred sites. And the ones that supposedly they made, which I think only accounts for about 5 of them, were located in fields that had no connection to sacred sites at all. But in the latter years, as more information gets published, they have tried to locate them as close as possible to try and throw people off the scent.
And is it being used at all? Are there sometimes crop circles in areas where there's no religious site visible to determine, well, there must be something here, and we can use it sort of as an archaeological pointer?
Yeah, as I was saying, someone actually wrote to me when they had a crop circle up in Washington State, and they were trying to find out, well, what's the connection here to local sacred sites, because they couldn't see anything, because you have to understand a lot of our sacred sites in this country have been bulldozed, they're now under asphalt. And they went to local libraries and found that, yes, within about 500 yards of the crop circle, there had been an ancient burial mound. So they're still happening, even in this country, they're still happening. Anybody else?
Mark Ray.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Have a good time.